I was perhaps no more than 9 when I first truly listened to the silence, not the absence of sound, but that vast and weighty hush that rests between all things. It was a silence that seemed to hum with presence, not emptiness, and it wrapped itself around me on a morning when the world seemed caught between breath and prayer. The sky over Balkh was pale and wide, tinged with the gold of a sun still too timid to burn away the night's cold. My father, Baha al-Din, walked ahead of me, lost in his own litany of whispered invocations, the sleeves of his robe fluttering with each step like 2 pages of an unending scripture caught in the wind. I had fallen behind, arrested not by a sight of grandeur, but by something so small and unnoticed it might as well have been invisible to the rest of the world, a dying fig tree on the edge of the path. Its branches curled in on themselves, brittle like old hands, its leaves yellowed and shrunken like words forgotten in time. At its base, the ground was cracked open, thirsty. And there, crawling with undisturbed purpose, was an army of ants. I crouched beside them, my knees pressed into the earth, feeling the heat of the rising day seep into my skin. I watched the ants in silence, fascinated, disturbed, drawn. They carried fragments of things far larger than themselves, crumbs of bread, bits of shell, broken wings of other insects. One ant in particular caught my attention. It was dragging a heavy load, some torn-off piece of fruit skin, struggling to move forward with the weight of it. It would advance a few inches, pause, readjust, try again. Sometimes the burden fell off entirely, and the ant would start over, undeterred. I stared at it for what must have been nearly an hour, though time felt strange in that moment, elastic and slow. There was something deeply human in that little creature's persistence, and yet something terribly tragic. It never looked up, never stopped to wonder why it did what it did. It just crawled forward, driven by some unseen script written into its body. And as I watched, a strange feeling unfurled in me, like a knot loosening at the base of my spine, rising slowly, painfully, into awareness. I did not yet have the vocabulary to name it, but it was something like grief. Not grief for the ant, no, but grief for myself. For all of us. I thought of the adults I knew, the scholars, the merchants, the men who filled the mosques and marketplaces. So many of them crawled too, didn't they? Each carrying burdens, titles, traditions, grudges, expectations, and doing so without ever pausing to look up at the sky. Without wondering if there was more than this daily, dutiful shuffle toward a death no one questioned. My fingers dug into the dirt. I remember lifting a pinch of soil and watching it sift between my fingers, soft and ancient. How many had walked this earth before me? How many had labored without ever truly living, mistaking survival for purpose? I remember the way the wind picked up just then, lifting a strand of my hair and carrying with it a scent of dust and something older, perhaps the memory of a storm or of tears long dried. When my father noticed I was no longer beside him, he turned back. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, soft, measured, echoing the rhythm of a man who walked not just through space but through meaning. He approached quietly, not with anger but with the kind of curiosity only the wise possess. He knelt beside me, following my gaze toward the fig tree and the trail of ants. "What do you see, Jalal?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Words felt too crude for what I was feeling. Eventually, I said, "It keeps crawling. Even when it's tired. Even when the weight is too much." My father nodded thoughtfully. He took a long breath before he replied. "The world is full of such creatures. Some are ants. Some are men. But the saddest of all are those who do not know they are crawling." We were silent after that, the way only those comfortable with silence can be. Then he placed a hand gently on my shoulder and said, "You, my son, were not born for the dust alone. Never forget that." I did not fully understand his words then. How could I? I was still a child, still enchanted by books and chants, by the certainty of rules and the praise of elders. I was a student in a world that revered knowledge more than understanding, discipline more than surrender. I memorized verses, repeated the sayings of the prophet, read the words of Aristotle and Avicenna, not yet realizing that the soul does not find its wings in repetition, but in stillness and surrender. Yet from that day forward, something had shifted within me. A seed was planted deep beneath the soil of my young heart. I began to look at people differently. I saw the way merchants moved like sleepwalkers through the bazaar, the way scholars defended their opinions as if they were kingdoms, the way prayers were recited more out of habit than hunger. I felt a growing restlessness within me, though I could not have explained its cause. All I knew was that something in the world felt unfinished, incomplete. And at night, when I lay in bed beneath the vast dome of sky, I would close my eyes and feel a strange stirring behind my ribs. As if wings were folded there, dormant and waiting. I had never seen an angel, never seen anyone fly outside of dreams, yet I somehow knew that I, too, had been born with wings. Not of feather or bone, but of spirit, of something older than breath. Still, I said nothing. I did not speak of the ants, or the ache in my chest, or the dreams of flight. I buried it all inside me, beneath my studies, beneath my prayers, beneath the identity of the obedient scholar son. But the knowing remained, like a silent companion, like a second heartbeat. Years would pass before I would meet the man who would crack me open like a pot sealed too long, shams of Tabriz. But even then, long before his shadow fell across my path, the truth had begun to whisper. In the movements of ants, in the silence between footsteps, in the aching memory of wings I had not yet learned to spread. And that is how it began, not with a revelation, not with thunder or light, but with a dying tree, a struggling ant, and a silence so deep it became the first language of my soul. There are seasons in a man's life when everything he has built begins to feel like a prison, though no walls are visible and no chains clang in the air. My prison was made of praise and parchment, of footnotes and respectful nods, of accolades that echoed louder than my own heartbeat. I was surrounded by men who bowed when I entered, who scribbled my words as though they were sacred, and who repeated my interpretations as though they were law. It should have filled me with joy, I suppose. For any other man, it might have been enough. But instead, it filled me with a quiet dread, like hearing the laughter of others at your funeral. In the earliest days, when I first entered the madrasa as a teacher, I was aflame with purpose. I believed I had been chosen to illuminate the minds of others. I had tasted every fruit the tree of scholarship could offer: grammar, logic, metaphysics, theology, jurisprudence. I could name the angels in descending order, I could quote Aristotle in the context of divine predestination, and I could parse the language of God into neat, bite-sized laws. But something had begun to curdle within me, like milk left too long in the sun. My words, once vibrant with discovery, began to feel like memorized lines in a play I no longer believed in. I wore my robes like armor, but the battles I fought were all internal, invisible, unspoken. There were days I would walk through the streets of Konya and catch the scent of jasmine or bread baking in clay ovens, and I would be pulled, suddenly, irrationally, into a longing so strong it felt like grief. Not for something I had lost, but for something I had never found. The scholars I dined with each evening spoke of destiny and jurisprudence with a certainty that exhausted me. They polished their arguments like prized swords, not to cut through illusion, but to defend their pride. And though I smiled and nodded and occasionally joined the debate, my soul remained elsewhere, a ghost hovering above my body, watching, always watching. It was in those quiet, dissonant moments that I began to feel the first fluttering beneath my ribs. Not of wings, but of remembrance. Of something older than learning, something more primal than logic. I could not name it then, but it made me restless. I would often rise before dawn and walk alone outside the city gates, beneath a sky still wet with stars. I would whisper prayers, not the formal ones, not the rehearsed invocations of religious etiquette, but the raw kind, the kind that trembled like a reed in the wind. One morning, I found myself by a stream just before sunrise. The water was slow and glass-like, and a single heron stood on one leg, motionless in its patience. I watched it for a long time, envying its stillness, the ease with which it belonged to the world. Then suddenly, without sound or struggle, it rose into the sky. No wind, no announcement. It simply stretched its wings and left the ground behind. I stood there stunned, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, not because of the beauty of the moment, but because of its familiarity. That, I realized, is what I was meant for. That quiet rising, that surrender to something greater than effort. I returned home with the memory of that bird folded like a note inside my chest. And I began to change, not outwardly, not yet, but inwardly. I started to teach with less certainty. I began to ask my students questions instead of giving them answers. When they asked about divine will, I asked them if they had ever truly listened to the will of their own hearts. When they spoke of reward and punishment, I asked them if they had ever stood beside a dying man and watched how love mattered more than doctrine. Some were inspired. Others were confused. A few were offended. And the scholars? They began to speak of me in hushed tones. "He's becoming too soft," one said. "He's letting mysticism infect his logic," another warned. But I no longer feared their disapproval. For the first time, I had begun to doubt the ladder I had climbed. Not because it was wrong, but because it did not reach the heavens. It led only to more ladders. And what I longed for was not height, but depth. Not recognition, but union. I began to seek out the outcasts, the dervishes, the wandering poets, the candlemakers who whispered poems under their breath, the mothers who sang lullabies to orphans not born of their blood. I sat with them in the shadow of mosques and under olive trees. I listened more than I spoke. And what I heard changed me. They did not speak with the sophistication of scholars, but their words had weight. They told me stories of heartbreak and healing, of moments when the veil between this world and the next became so thin it shimmered like silk. They spoke of dreams, of visions, of sudden moments of joy that came from nowhere and left behind a stillness deeper than sleep. I remember one woman, a bread seller, her hands cracked with flour and fire, who said to me, "You speak beautifully, Master. But have you ever wept while kneading dough? Have you ever felt your own heartbeat in a piece of bread?" I shook my head. She smiled gently and said, "Then you are still outside." Still outside. That phrase haunted me for weeks. I had lived my life on the threshold, reading maps, drawing blueprints, explaining the architecture of the house of God, but I had not stepped inside. I had not let the divine enter me like breath, like hunger, like music. One night, I returned to my study and stared at the shelves, row after row of books, all of them filled with words, all of them echoing the minds of men who, like me, searched but may never have surrendered. I pulled a scroll at random, unrolled it, and stared at the words until they blurred. Then I did something I had never done before. I blew out the candle. I sat in the darkness. And I waited. And in that darkness, something arrived. Not a voice, not a vision, but a feeling. A remembering. A presence. It was as if the silence itself had entered the room and wrapped its arms around me. And within that silence, I heard a single question echo through my chest. "Why do you crawl?" I wept. Not because I had failed, but because I had finally stopped pretending I hadn't. In the days that followed, I continued my teaching, but with less grandeur. My lectures grew quieter. My pauses grew longer. I looked at my students not as vessels to fill, but as flames to tend. I stopped trying to convince. I began to invite. And all the while, deep inside me, I could feel the wings beginning to stir. They were still bound, still buried beneath years of identity, but they were there. And I knew, without knowing how, that one day soon, they would rise. That one day soon would no longer teach the architecture of the divine. I would become the open window through which the divine wind could pass. And when that day came, I would no longer crawl, not through books, not through sermons, not through the praise of men. I would sly. Because I was born to. It was an afternoon like any other, or so it seemed. The merchants of Konya called out their prices with the usual enthusiasm. The minaret's shadow stretched slowly over the cobbled street, and the scent of saffron and tanned leather danced in the breeze. Yet something, some invisible thread, tugged at the edge of my awareness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I had just finished a lecture on the hierarchy of angels, surrounded by eager students and scrolls splayed open like wings across the floor. I spoke with certainty, precision, poise, my voice echoing across the stone arches as if even the architecture approved of my words. They hung on every sentence, nodding, scribbling, bowing their heads at the brilliance of ideas they believed belonged to me. And yet, deep within, I felt no triumph, only the hollow fatigue of a man who had delivered yet another perfect performance. It was in this state of subdued unrest that I wandered toward the tea house, hoping the bitterness of strong tea might anchor me. And that was when I saw him. He sat beneath a crooked mulberry tree whose gnarled roots seemed to grip the earth like clenched fists. His cloak was dusty, patched in places, and his sandals looked as though they had crossed entire lifetimes. There was nothing impressive about him, not in the way scholars impress, or mystics dazzle with their theatrics. No halo of words, no entourage, no visible mark of his station. But the air around him, it vibrated with something fierce and ancient. It was as if the space he occupied remembered what we all had forgotten. His eyes were closed, his cup untouched, but as I passed, he opened them, and our gazes met. No word was spoken in that moment, and yet I felt it, the undeniable sense that he had seen me, not as the scholar, the Maulana, the teacher or theologian, but as I truly was beneath all that, a child who had lost his sky. I walked on, shaken, pretending it hadn't happened. That night, sleep did not come easily. I lay in my chamber, listening to the sigh of wind against my shutters, feeling the familiar weight of my books lining the shelves. The words I had poured into those pages, the thoughts I had chased across years and continents, they all seemed suddenly distant. Beautiful, yes. Impressive. But lifeless. Like flowers pressed into a book, elegant, preserved, but long since dead. The next day, as if summoned by fate itself, he appeared at the madrasa. He entered not as a guest, nor as a student, nor as one seeking permission. He entered like weather, inevitable, uninvited, and utterly natural. There was a ripple in the air as he crossed the courtyard. Conversations paused. Heads turned. My students stared, confused by the boldness of this man who did not bow, who did not remove his sandals, who did not avert his gaze. He walked with the assuredness of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood from my chair as he approached, my heart strangely alert, as though it had awoken from a long slumber. "Are you the one they call Maulana?" he asked. His voice was neither loud nor soft, but it held within it the gravity of mountains. I nodded. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You speak of God as if you have him caged in your language." My students gasped. One even rose, prepared to defend my honor. I raised a hand and silenced them. Not because I was offended, but because I was pierced. No one had ever spoken to me that way. Not even my father, who was a great man in his own right. This stranger had not insulted me, he had undressed me with a single sentence. I felt as though he had walked into a temple and shattered all my carefully arranged idols. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. He bowed his head, slightly, the ghost of a smile at the edge of his lips. "I am Shams of Tabriz. I am not here to flatter your mind. I am here to burn it." Something inside me quaked. It was not fear. It was recognition. From that moment, my life split like the Red Sea. There was the Rumi I had been before Shams, and the Rumi I was yet to become. We began meeting in private. Not as master and disciple, but as two mirrors held to one another. Our conversations defied structure, and logic quickly melted under the heat of presence. He asked me questions that stunned the mind and awakened the soul. He'd ask, what is beyond the names of God? Or, can the heart pray without lips? Or, is your love for God based on reward? Or does it bloom even in the absence of heaven? Sometimes we would sit in silence for hours, letting the world pass by like a forgotten boat on a distant shore. Other times, we'd argue with such intensity that it drew attention from those nearby. But I no longer cared about appearances. I cared only about truth, not the kind I could lecture on, but the kind that possessed you. He told me, you fed the mind. Now starve it. Let your soul eat. I wept in his presence many times, not out of sadness, but because I realized how starved I truly was. I had spent years feeding my intellect, but my spirit was gaunt, my inner world barren. Shams was not polite about it. He spoke in riddles and riddled me with truths. He was fire and wind and mirror and sword. And in him, I saw the one thing I had searched for my entire life, someone who did not want anything from me, only something for me. Freedom. It was he who asked the question that changed everything. One moonless night, we stood on the rooftop of the mosque. The world below slept, unaware that my soul was about to awaken. He looked at me and said, you were born with wings, Jalal. Why do you crawl through life? I fell silent. It was not a question to be answered, it was a truth to be surrendered to. He had voiced the ache I had carried since childhood, the same ache I saw in the crawling ant, the ache I had buried beneath books and reputation and sermons. Why do we crawl? Out of fear, out of habit, out of forgetfulness. But he had remembered. And now, by grace or madness or fate, he had come to help me remember. From that night on, everything changed. My lectures grew stranger. I spoke less from certainty and more from wonder. I stopped quoting and started listening, not just to others, but to the silence between breaths. My prayers became weeping. My sermons became poetry. My pride was shattered, and in its place rose something tender, raw, and holy. People began to talk. Some said I had lost my mind. Others said I had fallen under the spell of a heretic. But I no longer lived by their praise or their judgment. I was remembering my wings. And once you begin to remember, truly remember, you can no longer pretend the ground is your home. You begin to rise, even if it means burning everything that once made you feel safe. Shams did not teach me how to fly. He reminded me that I already could. And from that remembrance, I would go on to become something neither of us could yet name. But the flame had been lit, and I would never crawl again. In the weeks and months that followed our first meeting, my life was irrevocably transformed, though I did not understand the full extent of this change at the time. Shams of Tabriz was unlike anyone I had ever encountered, not a scholar, not a cleric, not even a typical mystic. He was a tempest, a wild flame that could not be tamed or contained by the neat formulas and rigid doctrines I had spent my life mastering. Before him, my knowledge, so painstakingly acquired, felt brittle, like a fragile web in a storm. My certainty, once a solid fortress, crumbled into dust beneath the force of his presence. Our conversations did not follow the polite rhythms of teaching and learning that I was accustomed to. Instead, they were spontaneous eruptions, lightning strikes that illuminated truths I had only glimpsed in dreams. We would sit for hours beneath the shade of ancient trees or on the stone steps of the madrasa, speaking in riddles, in poetry, in silence. He challenged everything I thought I knew. He did not seek to instruct me, but to awaken me. You have fed your mind enough, he said one evening, now feed your soul. Let it feast upon the fire of longing and surrender. His words unsettled me deeply. I had always been proud of my scholarship, my ability to debate and to teach, to quote scripture and philosophy alike. But I began to see that this pride was a cage, gilded and comfortable, but a cage nonetheless. Shams showed me that true knowledge is not the accumulation of facts or arguments, but the dissolution of the self into the greater whole. That the heart's wisdom cannot be grasped by reason alone, and that love is the language beyond words. One night, we walked together beneath a sky thick with stars, the air cool and fragrant with jasmine. He turned to me and asked, "Tell me, Jalal, do you love God because He is your reward, or do you love Him simply because He is?" I faltered, caught off guard by the simplicity and depth of the question. I had spent my life worshiping God with the hope of heaven and the fear of hell, but did I truly love Him beyond those concerns? Did I love without conditions, without expectation? He smiled gently, sensing my turmoil. "Fear is the shadow of love," he said. "But love, true love, sets wings to the soul." His words echoed in my heart long after the night had passed. I began to pray differently, no longer reciting words to fulfill duty, but opening my soul in yearning, in vulnerability. I found myself weeping, not out of sorrow, but because I was finally touching something real, something alive within me. The people around me noticed my transformation, and not all were pleased. Some whispered that I was being led astray by a heretic. Others feared that I was abandoning the path of righteousness. My students grew restless, unsure of the new humility and doubt I carried like a second skin. Yet I could not turn back to the old ways, for I had glimpsed a horizon too vast to ignore. Shams was my mirror and my fire. He forced me to confront the parts of myself I had long denied, the hunger, the fear, the desire to be free. When he asked, "Why do you crawl through life when you were born with wings?" he was not merely posing a question but issuing a challenge. To stop settling for safety and certainty, and to risk everything in the pursuit of freedom. I realized then that I had been crawling, through books, through ceremonies, through the approval of men, when I was meant to soar. I had been trapped in a maze of intellect, afraid to trust the soaring call of the heart. Slowly, painfully, I began to let go. I shed the layers of pride and pretense, the need to be right, the fear of judgment. I began to dance, to sing, to pour out my soul in poetry that defied the rigid structures of scholarship. I learned that true wisdom is born in the depths of surrender, and that love, in its purest form, is flight. In Shams, I found a companion who saw me not as a master or a scholar, but as a fellow traveler on the endless journey toward the beloved. With him, I learned that the path is not a ladder to be climbed, but a dance to be danced, that the soul's wings are not made to be folded but to be spread wide in the open sky. And so, the crawling stopped. I learned to fly, not because the earth was conquered, but because I remembered my true nature. I was born with wings, and it was time to rise. The realization that I was meant to fly, not crawl, was not the sudden flash of insight that many seek, but rather a slow, unfolding awakening that stretched across days and months and even years. It was a gradual peeling away of the layers of my old self, the scholar, the teacher, the man cloaked in certainty, and a delicate unfolding of something far deeper, more fragile, and more true. For most of my life, I had believed that knowledge was the highest path to God. I had spent countless hours bent over manuscripts, debating the nuances of theology, memorizing scripture, and constructing arguments that dazzled my peers. Yet beneath all the scholarship, there was a persistent whisper, a quiet pulse that beat beneath my ribs, urging me to look beyond the books, beyond the praises and titles, beyond the safe confines of learned wisdom. It was a voice I had tried to ignore, but Shams of Tabriz, with his fierce eyes and fearless words, gave that whisper its voice and volume. When he first asked me, "You were born with wings, why do you prefer to crawl through life?" I felt the full weight of that question descend upon me like a sudden winter storm. How was it that I, a man who had climbed so many ladders of learning and respectability, had been content to drag myself slowly through existence, tethered by invisible chains of fear and habit? Crawling was easier, safer. Crawling meant I could avoid the risks of falling, the vulnerability of flight, the wild unknown beyond the ground. Yet crawling was not my nature. It was an illusion I had accepted because it felt familiar and secure. The more I sat with this question, the more I realized that crawling was not merely a habit but a kind of forgetting. I had forgotten my own divinity, my own capacity for boundless freedom. I had traded my wings for the weight of expectations, the expectation to be a learned man, a respected teacher, a voice of authority. I had wrapped myself in the robes of knowledge and tradition like a protective shell, afraid to shatter the image of the perfect scholar, even if it meant suffocating the deeper truth inside me. But the wings, they were still there, buried beneath the layers of doubt and conformity, waiting to be remembered. The journey toward flight was neither swift nor easy. It was a winding path, fraught with moments of fear, shame, and uncertainty. I had to confront the pride that whispered I was already enough, the fear that I was too old or too broken to learn new ways, and the grief of realizing how much time I had spent in shadow. But alongside these struggles, there was also a growing flame, a hunger for liberation, a yearning for connection that surpassed the intellect and touched the soul's deepest core. I began to sit quietly with myself, to listen not to the cacophony of the mind but to the soft murmur of the heart. I learned to embrace silence, not as emptiness but as a sacred space where wings could unfold. In those moments of stillness, I observed the world anew. I watched birds glide effortlessly above the rooftops, their wings catching the light with ease I envied. I felt the breeze carry the scent of jasmine and earth, and I marveled at how nature itself seemed to embody the freedom I sought. I walked through the markets and saw children laughing and dancing, unburdened by the fears that weighed me down. Their joy was a reminder that flight is not a distant dream but a birthright. Shams remained my companion and my mirror throughout this transformation. He did not offer answers or comfort. Instead, he held up a flame that burned away my illusions. When I faltered, he challenged me. When I doubted, he held my gaze with unwavering faith. He lived with a wildness and authenticity that terrified and inspired me in equal measure. His presence was a constant reminder that the path to God is not paved with certainty but walked on the edge of surrender. My teaching changed along with me. No longer was I content to fill my students' minds with facts and doctrine. I sought to awaken their hearts, to invite them into the mystery of the unseen. I spoke less of laws and more of love, less of judgment and more of mercy. Some embraced this new way with wonder, others recoiled in confusion or fear. But I had come to understand that the journey toward flight is deeply personal. Each soul must find its own rhythm and courage. As I embraced this transformation, the world around me seemed to shift as well. Simple moments became infused with sacredness, the warm touch of sunlight on my skin, the taste of fresh bread, the sound of water flowing in a distant stream. I realized that flight is not about escaping the earth, but about fully inhabiting it with open wings and an open heart. To fly is to embrace both the heights and the depths of life with equal grace. There were times when the fear of falling returned, heavy as a stone in my chest. But each time, I reminded myself that wings are meant to carry us beyond fear. I learned to trust the invisible currents of love and grace that lift us when we dare to surrender. I discovered that true freedom is not the absence of struggle but the courage to rise despite it. And so I continue to learn what it means to fly, not in some distant sky, but here and now, in the unfolding moments of my life. Every breath is a prayer, every step a dance, every heartbeat an invitation to soar beyond the limits of fear and doubt. I was born with wings, and now I choose to rise. The journey toward embracing the wings I was born with was neither quick nor easy. It was a slow and unfolding awakening, filled with countless moments of doubt, fear, and hesitation. For years, I had lived my life grounded, bound by the weight of knowledge, tradition, and the expectations of others. I had believed that wisdom came from study and reason, that the path to the divine was paved with careful steps and measured words. Yet beneath the surface, a restless whisper stirred within me, a yearning that no book could satisfy nor argument quench. This yearning was the soul's longing to take flight, to break free from the shackles of certainty and control, to dance with the mystery beyond all knowing. Shams of Tabriz was the one who awakened that longing, who shook me from my slumber and confronted me with the truth I had hidden from myself. When he asked, "You were born with wings, why do you prefer to crawl through life?" It was not a mere question, it was a summons to awaken from the dull routine of existence and remember the limitless freedom within. But such awakening demands courage. The soul must face its fears, its doubts, its shadows, and still choose to rise. To fly is to embrace vulnerability, uncertainty, and the wildness of the unknown. I remember one night beneath a sky swollen with stars, when the cool breeze whispered secrets through the olive branches. I sat alone in the courtyard of the madrasa, my heart heavy with both longing and hesitation. I asked myself, how can I soar when my wings feel fragile and untested? How do I let go of the comfort of the earth, even if it feels like a cage, for the vast and open sky, which promises both ecstasy and peril? The answers did not come all at once. Instead, they emerged slowly, like the dawn creeping across the horizon. I began to notice the small miracles of flight around me, in the effortless glide of birds, in the children's laughter as they chased each other through the streets, in the way the wind carried the scent of jasmine far and wide. These were not just moments of beauty, but lessons whispered by life itself, that to live fully is to trust the currents, to lift one's wings and dare to move beyond fear. The path was not without struggle. There were days when the weight of my old fears dragged me back into crawling, when the voice of doubt murmured that I was not worthy, not ready, that the risks of flight were too great. The world around me, the scholars, the students, the townspeople, sometimes looked on with confusion or suspicion, unable to understand the fire that had been kindled within me. But Shams was unwavering. He stood like a pillar of flame beside me, reflecting back my own truth, demanding that I not settle for half living, half loving. He taught me that flight is not the absence of falling but the willingness to rise again, to let each stumble become a lesson in grace. He showed me that the wings of the soul are forged in fire, the fire of longing, loss, joy, and surrender. He reminded me that the beloved calls us not to safety but to freedom, not to certainty but to trust. In time, I began to surrender, not in defeat, but in devotion. I let go of the need to control, to understand fully, to be accepted. I opened myself to the vastness of love and the mystery beyond words. I began to dance, not just in body, but in spirit, spinning in the light of divine presence, feeling my soul lift and expand with each turning. This dance was messy, imperfect, and sometimes frightening, but it was life itself. With each step, I remembered more deeply who I was, a being born not to crawl but to fly, to soar beyond the limits of mind and fear, to embrace the fullness of existence with open wings and open heart. I saw that the journey is not about escaping the earth, but about inhabiting it fully, with the freedom of the sky within. Now, each day is a new invitation to rise, to trust, to love fiercely and without hesitation. The wings I once hid beneath fear and convention now spread wide, catching the winds of grace and carrying me beyond what I once thought possible. I was born with wings, and now, at last, I choose to fly. The transformation that began with Sham's fiery arrival did not settle into a comfortable rhythm but instead pulled me deeper into a mysterious and often turbulent unfolding of self. It was as if I had been living beneath a heavy veil of certainty, wrapped in the fine but suffocating cloth of tradition and intellect, and suddenly that veil was lifted, exposing me to the raw wind of the unknown. The words he spoke, "You were born with wings, why prefer to crawl through life?" became a constant, haunting refrain, a call to remember the very essence of my being that had been forgotten beneath years of study, duty, and social expectation. Yet to answer that call was no simple matter. The journey toward flight was marked by fierce internal battles and wrenching confrontations with my own limitations. The wings that I was born with felt fragile and untested, like fledgling feathers just beginning to sprout from a nest not yet left behind. The sky above was vast and daunting, filled with unknown currents and storms that threatened to overwhelm rather than uplift. My heart trembled with fear, fear of falling, fear of losing control, fear of being rejected by those whose respect I had long cherished. The community around me valued certainty, measured knowledge, and conformity to established paths. To step into the wild, unpredictable dance of love and surrender was to risk everything. This tension became a crucible for my soul. On one hand, there was the deep longing for freedom and truth, the yearning to soar beyond the confines of fear and intellect. On the other, the pull of safety and habit, the comforting weight of known identities and roles. The fear of judgment echoed loudly, from friends, colleagues, students, and even from my own inner voice that clung stubbornly to the familiar. But every time I hesitated, the memory of Sham's words would flare within me, a beacon cutting through the fog. You were born with wings. I began to understand that crawling was a kind of forgetfulness, a spiritual amnesia that dulled the soul's brilliance. Like a bird trapped in a cage, no matter how gilded, I had been living a life that was safe but small, constrained by walls I had built with my own hands. With Sham's unwavering presence, I was forced to face these truths head-on. He did not offer easy comfort or gentle guidance, but acted as a mirror reflecting back my own fears and illusions, as a fire that consumed my pretenses and purified my soul. I learned that fear itself was not the enemy but a gatekeeper, an invitation to deeper trust and greater courage. To fly, I realized, means to embrace vulnerability, to rise not because we are free from doubt, but because we choose to transcend it. Our conversations became more than discourse, they were sacred rituals. He taught me to listen deeply, not only with my ears but with every fiber of my being, to the silence that speaks between words, to the spaces between heartbeats, to the infinite vastness within and beyond the self. The soul is a bird who knows the sky, he said, but forgets its wings until the storm calls it home. I began to see that the storms, both within and without, are not punishments but invitations, powerful forces that awaken the soul's hidden capacities. One afternoon, sitting beneath the wide branches of an ancient oak, Shams took my hand with a gentleness that belied the intensity of his spirit. "Jalal," he said softly, "you have spent years reading the book of God with your mind. Now it is time to read it with your heart and soul, to learn the language of wings." I felt a mixture of exhilaration and dread, a rush of longing mingled with the hesitation of stepping into the unknown. From that day forward, my poetry changed. No longer did I compose verses that merely pleased the intellect or adhered to classical forms. Instead, the words poured forth like wild rivers bursting their banks, raw, passionate, and untamed. I wrote of love that burns and heals, of longing that dissolves the self, of the sacred dance between separation and union. My poetry became a living flame, a reflection of the fire kindled within me by the call to flight. As I embraced this new way of being, the world around me seemed to shift as well. The air felt crisper, the colors more vivid, the smallest moments filled with sacredness, the warmth of the sun on my skin, the laughter of children, the whisper of wind through the leaves. Life itself became a prayer, each breath a hymn of freedom. Yet the journey was far from linear or easy. There were days when the shadows of doubt and fear returned with relentless force, when the weight of expectation and old habits pulled me back toward crawling. But with every return, my wings grew stronger, my heart more expansive. I came to understand that to fly is not to escape darkness, but to carry light within it. It is to be fully present to both the heights of joy and the depths of sorrow, knowing that both are essential to the dance of the soul. Now, as I walk this path, I feel the gentle but powerful call of the sky still drawing me upward. Each day offers new lessons in surrender and courage, new opportunities to spread my wings wider and trust the invisible currents that carry us beyond fear and limitation. I was born with wings, and though the journey is endless, I choose, again and again, to rise, to soar, to embrace the vast, wild freedom of my true self. As my soul stretched its newly discovered wings, the world around me transformed in ways both subtle and profound, as though a veil had been lifted from my eyes to reveal the vast, luminous landscape that had always existed just beyond my perception. Each day unfolded like a delicate petal, revealing new depths of beauty, mystery, and sacredness I had never truly noticed before. The ordinary became extraordinary. The simplest breeze carried the whisper of the divine, the rustling leaves were a sacred chorus, the distant call of a nightingale was an echo of eternity. It was as if the very fabric of reality shimmered with presence, waiting to be seen not by the eyes of flesh and reason, but by the eyes of the heart and soul. This awakening, however, was not without its challenges. The wings I was born with demanded more than just courage, they required complete surrender. To fly was not to drift gently or to float aimlessly, but to engage in a dynamic, often tumultuous dance with the unseen winds of grace, love, and mystery. These winds sometimes lifted me effortlessly, sometimes tossed me wildly, but always invited me onward. Flight was a continuous, unfolding journey, a daily, moment-by-moment choice to release control, to abandon certainty, and to trust the vast unknown. I recall countless mornings when the first pale light of dawn spilled softly through the latticed windows of my chamber, weaving golden threads across the cold stone floor. I would awaken before the city stirred, before the merchants called, before the call to prayer echoed from the minarets, and I would rise, drawn irresistibly outside. Standing barefoot on the dew-kissed earth, I would stretch my arms wide beneath the vast, endless sky and feel the immense weight and wonder of it pressing gently against my soul. The air was crisp and alive, tinged with the scent of blooming jasmine and the rich earth turned by morning laborers. In those precious, silent hours, I understood, flight is not a destination but a lifelong pilgrimage, not a momentary escape but an ongoing surrender to the currents of love that move through all creation. Shams was no longer simply a companion or teacher, he had become a living embodiment of this sacred journey. His spirit danced freely and fiercely, unbound by the conventions of society or the cages of fear. I found myself perpetually drawn to his untamed authenticity, even as it challenged the very foundations of my being. He would laugh suddenly, a wild, joyous sound that seemed to ripple through the ancient trees and awaken the stones beneath us. "Do you feel it, Jalal?" he would ask, eyes alight with a flame. "The beloved's breath stirring the leaves? We are not separate from this dance. We are the dance itself." His words were riddles wrapped in revelation, invitations to step beyond the brittle boundaries of thought and into the living mystery of experience. With him, I learned that wings are not merely instruments to leave the earth behind but sacred symbols of a profound freedom, the freedom to live fully, love deeply, and surrender utterly. To fly is to trust, with every fiber of your being, that even when the path ahead is shrouded in darkness, even when tempests rage and the ground below disappears, you are held by a power greater than fear. It is to open your heart so wide it becomes a vessel for grace and to offer yourself wholly to the eternal flow of life. This teaching seeped into every corner of my existence. I found myself less bound by the judgments of others, less shackled by the opinions that once held so much sway over me. Instead, I tuned my spirit to the subtle whisper of my own soul, listening for the sacred rhythms beneath the noise of the world. The shadows of fear that had once clung to me like a second skin began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet yet unshakable confidence, one rooted not in certainty or control but in faith. Faith in the journey, faith in the unseen hand that guides us, faith in the wings that carry us even when the sky seems empty and the winds unforgiving. I poured these revelations into poetry, which became my prayer, my offering, my song. My verses flowed not from learned eloquence, but from the rawness of lived experience and the fire of love. I wrote of longing that burns and transforms, of love that heals and destroys, of surrender that liberates. My words became wings themselves, carrying me and those who listen beyond the confines of the known and into the sacred unknown. I imagined the soul as a bird soaring above jagged mountains and tranquil valleys, rising through storms and sunlight alike, always moving toward the horizon where earth and sky meet in infinite embrace. Yet this path was far from linear or easy. There were days when the winds battered me, when loneliness wrapped cold fingers around my heart, when doubt whispered that I was lost, that I would never truly fly. In those shadowed moments, I would remember Sham's fierce gaze and his unwavering faith in the soul's innate capacity to rise. I would breathe deep, spread my wings inwardly, and trust the invisible currents that lift us beyond our limitations, beyond our fears. This transformation was not only within but reflected outwardly as well. The people around me, friends, students, even strangers, noticed the change. Some were bewildered by the wild freedom that now covered my spirit in words. Others felt stirred in their own hearts, sensing the call of wings within themselves. I realized the call to flight is not an isolated journey but a shared awakening, a song sung by countless souls across time and space, urging us to remember who we truly are, And so, with every dawn, I rise anew, embracing the ever-present invitation to live as though I am already flying, to trust love's power to carry me through every trial, and to spread my wings wide beneath the infinite sky of the soul. For I know now, beyond all doubt or hesitation, that I was born with wings. The heavens await, and I will soar. As I continued to unfurl my wings and rise above the narrow confines of fear and habit, I discovered that the path of flight is not a simple, straight road but a winding, ever-unfolding journey, one that demands constant vigilance, courage, and surrender. Each day revealed new challenges, storms that tested my resolve and resilience, moments when doubt and loneliness wrapped around my heart like a shroud. Yet, in the midst of these trials, I found the shimmering threads of freedom, threads woven from the very fabric of love, faith, and the infinite mystery that underlies all existence. Flight, I realized, is not merely an act of leaving the earth behind but a sacred transformation of the self, a continual letting go of the layers that obscure the soul's light. The wings I was born with called me beyond the illusions of control, pride, and certainty. They beckoned me to surrender, not in defeat, but in the courageous embrace of something far greater than my limited self. Surrender became an art, a practice of releasing the tight grasp on expectations and fears, opening myself fully to the divine currents that move through all things. It is a trust so deep that it carries the soul across chasms of uncertainty and lifts it above the storms of despair. This trust is not a passive waiting but a vibrant, living faith in the unseen forces that guide us toward union with the beloved. I learned that wings are not meant for self-aggrandizement or escape but are sacred instruments designed to carry the soul into the boundless sky of divine love. To fly is to transcend the narrow confines of ego and to touch the infinite. Yet this flight is balanced by the grounding of humility and compassion. Just as the falcon trusts the wind to lift it, yet remains rooted in the earth it surveys, so must the soul trust and remain compassionate, knowing it is part of a greater whole. To soar without humility is to risk falling. To fly without compassion is to lose one's way. I recall nights spent beneath the vast expanse of the star-studded sky, feeling simultaneously small and infinite. In those sacred hours, the boundaries of self blurred and dissolved, and I was woven into the tapestry of creation itself. The wings that carried me were not merely my own but belonged to every soul that longs, every heart that aches and heals, every being daring enough to dream beyond the confines of survival and comfort. This realization deepened my compassion for those who still crawl through life, shackled by fear, doubt, and the weight of past wounds. So many forget their wings, resigning themselves to limited existence, unaware that the door to freedom stands open. My heart ached for them, and it became my sacred calling to remind others of their birthright, to awaken their dormant wings and lift their gaze toward the sky. Yet, despite my desire to inspire others, I knew that my own journey was endless. The spiral of flight winds ever upward and inward, revealing new layers of resistance, fresh fears to face, and deeper invitations to surrender. There were moments of profound solitude and hardship when the winds were fierce and the sky seemed vast and empty. In those times, I found solace and strength in the silent presence of the beloved, in the sacred promise that no soul truly flies alone. I came to understand that the courage to fly arises not from the absence of fear but from the choice to move forward despite it. Spreading one's wings always carries the risk of falling, but each fall is itself a lesson, a sacred turning that brings us closer to the true sky within. The falcon does not question the wind, it leaps and trusts. So must I. And so, with every dawn, I rise anew, wings open wide, heart surrendered. I choose flight not because it is easy, but because it is the truest expression of the soul's yearning. Born with wings, I will soar, carried by love, guided by faith, anchored in the eternal dance of freedom and surrender. The sky is vast, the journey long, but my spirit is boundless, and I am ready to fly. As I stand here now, contemplating the vastness of the journey I have traveled, from the hesitant steps of a man bound by fear to the soaring flight of a soul awakened, I am struck by the profundity of the question that first shook me to my core. You were born with wings, why prefer to crawl through life? This is not merely a poetic expression, but a summons to remember the very essence of our being, the divine imprint within us that longs to rise, to expand, to embrace the infinite. The wings I was given are not light or fragile. They are powerful and resilient, born from the very breath of the beloved. Yet for so long, I chose to keep them folded, wrapped tightly around me as if they were burdens to be hidden. Crawling felt safer, less risky, less exposed. But in that choice, I denied the fullness of my existence. I traded the vast skies for narrow paths, the wild freedom of flight for the slow, earthbound shuffle of survival. To fly demands a courage unlike any other. It is the courage to face the storms within and without, to open oneself to the fierce winds of change and the unknown. Flight means embracing vulnerability with strength, surrendering control without losing oneself, and trusting in a love that transcends all fear. It is not an escape, but a deeper engagement with life, a passionate dance with joy and sorrow, with certainty and mystery, with loss and gain. In the quiet moments when the world fades away and I am alone with my heart, I feel the pulse of these wings beneath my skin. They stir like a sacred fire, igniting a longing that cannot be silenced. They remind me that to crawl is to deny the soul's birthright, to settle for less than what I was made for. I was created to soar, to rise above the petty fears and limitations that bind us, to embrace the limitless sky of possibility and love. Yet the path of flight is not a straight line but a spiral, ever rising and deepening. Each time I think I have mastered the art of flying, new challenges emerge, shadows that test my faith, doubts that whisper old fears, storms that threaten to break my spirit. But with every trial, my wings grow stronger, my heart more expansive. I learn anew that falling is not failure, but part of the sacred rhythm of rising. The falcon does not fear the storm, it rides the winds, carried by forces beyond itself. Flight has taught me humility, the humility to recognize that I am but a vessel for the divine, a servant to love's mysterious will. It has taught me compassion, for myself and others, knowing that every soul struggles with its own fears and cages, often unaware of the wings hidden within. I see now that my journey is not mine alone, but a thread in the great tapestry of humanity's awakening, a call to all who wander lost to remember their own power and grace. I embrace this journey with open wings and an open heart, knowing that the sky is vast and the winds ever-changing. Each day offers a new chance to rise, to trust, to surrender. The dance of flight is endless, a holy song of freedom and love that calls me beyond limits, beyond fear, into the boundless embrace of the beloved. Why prefer to crawl when the heavens await? Why settle for shadows when light calls? I choose flight, not because it is easy, but because it is true. I was born with wings, and I will soar, now, always, and forever, carried on the breath of love, into the infinite sky.